The school auditorium always smelled faintly of polish and old paper, the kind of place where history sat quietly in the walls. Banners hung from the ceiling, celebrating championships, debate trophies, and academic awards earned long before most of the current students had arrived. The school was proud of those banners. They were proof that excellence lived here, that success was expected, and that students were taught how to present themselves properly to the world. For Amara Johnson, walking into that building every morning felt like stepping into a space that admired achievement, but only in one specific shape. Amara was 16, tall for her age, with a posture that came naturally when you were raised to speak clearly and stand firm. Her hair was always neatly styled, her clothes simple but intentional. What truly set her apart, though, wasn't how she looked. It was how she spoke. When Amara talked, she didn't whisper her ideas into the air and hope someone caught them. She spoke with rhythm, with emotion, with hands that moved as if her thoughts needed space to breathe. Teachers noticed her immediately when she transferred to the school dot at first. They called her confident. They said she had presence. But as weeks passed, those words began to change. Confident turned into expressive. Expressive turned into intense. Intense quietly became too much. Amara didn't notice it all at once. It showed up in pauses, in raised eyebrows, in gentle reminders to lower her voice, even when she wasn't yelling. In comments like, "That's a great point, Amara, but let's bring the energy down a bit." No one said she was wrong. They just kept suggesting she was doing it wrong. At home, her parents encouraged her to keep speaking up. They had always taught her that her voice mattered, that intelligence wasn't meant to hide. They reminded her that being articulate was a gift. Amara believed them. She still does. But belief gets complicated when the world keeps sending a different message. The speech competition was announced at the start of October. Posters appeared in the hallways, printed in bold letters: annual academic speech, competition, elegance, clarity, professionalism. Teachers talked it up in class, explaining how past winners had gone on to scholarships and recognition. It wasn't just a contest, it was a reputation builder. Amara felt the pull the moment she heard about it. She loved public speaking, loved the way words could shift a room, how silence could be earned instead of demanded. She had already begun shaping ideas in her head before the announcement even finished. This was her space. This was where she felt most herself, but she also noticed the looks. A few classmates glanced at her, then at each other, expressions unreadable. One girl smiled politely, then leaned over to whisper something to her friend. A boy behind her muttered, "This is gonna be boring," under his breath, not bothering to hide the smirk that followed. Later that day, a teacher pulled Amara aside and suggested she consider the tone expected for formal competitions. The advice was wrapped in kindness, delivered softly, but the meaning landed hard. Be careful. Don't be too much. Fit the mold, Amara nodded. She always did. That night, she sat at her desk, notebook open, pen resting between her fingers. Words flowed easily onto the page, powerful, honest, alive. This was how she thought, how she felt, how she existed. And yet, a question crept in that she hated for how familiar it felt. Would her voice cost her the opportunity? Outside her window, the school lights glowed faintly in the distance, steady and unbothered. Inside her room, Amara stared at the page, caught between who she was and who she was being asked to become. She didn't know it yet, but the competition wouldn't just test her speaking skills. It would test whether she was allowed to be heard at all. The first real moment didn't happen on a stage. It happened in a classroom, in the middle of an ordinary discussion. When Amara forgot to shrink herself for just a second. It was a Wednesday, the kind of day that dragged. Rain tapped lightly against the windows, and the room smelled like dry erase markers and damp hoodies. In English class, they were discussing persuasive writing, how to make people feel something, how to shift opinions without forcing them. The teacher asked a question about tone and delivery, and a few students offered safe answers, the kind that sounded correct without saying much. Amara raised her hand. When she spoke, her words came out clean and certain, the way they always did when she cared. She referenced a speech she'd watched the night before, explained how the speaker used emotion to make the room listen, how silence wasn't always calm, but could be powerful. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't disrespectful. She was engaged, but the room changed anyway. A few students turned in their seats, not to listen more like they were bracing. Someone near the back let out a small laugh, quick and dismissive, like the confidence in her voice was something funny. Another student rolled their eyes and whispered, "Here she goes." Then the teacher interrupted her, not harshly, not loudly, with a smile that was too. Practice. The teacher said Amara had great points, but she needed to bring the volume down. She said the room didn't need a performance. She suggested Amara should work on sounding more controlled. If she wanted people to take her seriously, the words landed like a hand on her throat. Amara blinked once, trying to process what had just happened. Her voice hadn't been loud. Her tone hadn't been rude. Nothing about her response was out of line. But the correction was delivered like a fact, something everyone already agreed with. That's what made it sting, because it wasn't about volume. It was about comfort. The teacher turned to another student immediately, as if Amara's contribution had been handled and filed away. The class moved on. The moment passed, but Amara felt heat in her cheeks, and not the kind that came from embarrassment alone. It was frustration mixed with disbelief, and something deeper that felt old, even though she was young. After class, she heard it again. In the hallway, a couple of students walked behind her, voices low but careless. One of them said she was always doing the most. Another said, "She's smart, but she's too loud." Like chill. A third voice added something about her needing to learn how to act. They laughed softly, like it was harmless. Amara kept walking as if she didn't hear, but her body heard it. Her shoulders tightened slightly. Her pace changed. Her breathing went shallower. That automatic adjustment that happened when you were trying to look unbothered in front of people who wanted a reaction. She stared straight ahead, pretending the hallway noise was all the same. By lunch, the story had already shifted. It wasn't that Amara had spoken passionately in class. It was that she'd gone off. It wasn't that she'd made a strong point. It was that she'd made it about her. The version that spread wasn't the truth. It was the version that made people feel justified in disliking her confidence. What made it worse was how easy it was for them. No one asked what she actually said. No one cared that the teacher cut her off while letting other students ramble freely. No one questioned why confidence looked different when it came from her. Amara sat at lunch with her tray in front of her, barely touching her food. Across the cafeteria, she saw the speech competition posters again. The words elegance, clarity, professionalism stared back like a warning dressed up as encouragement. That's when she felt the first blow clearly. Not the teasing, not even the teacher's interruption. The first blow was realizing that in this building, her voice was already being treated like a problem before she ever stepped into the competition. And if people were already calling her too loud when she was simply answering a question, what would they call her when she stood on a stage and refused to whisper? Amara didn't stop speaking after that day. She just started editing herself. It happened quietly, the way habits do when they're built from survival instead of choice. She raised her hand less often, When she did speak, she measured every word before letting it out, flattening her tone, softening her delivery. She watched other students closely, how they leaned back in their chairs when they talked, how they joked with teachers, how their confidence was read as charm instead of challenge. She tried to sound like that Dot, and every time she did, something inside her tightened. Dot at home. Her parents noticed the shift before she ever said anything. She spent more time in her room, earbuds in, practicing speeches under her breath instead of projecting them the way she used to. When they asked about school, she said it was fine too quickly, like she wanted to close the topic before it opened into something heavier. Late one night, she stood in front of her mirror, phone propped up on her desk, recording herself. She watched the playback with a critical eye, not for content, but for perception. Was her voice too sharp? Too animated? Too much? She deleted the video. Then she recorded another one, quieter this time, slower, safer. She deleted that one too. The conflict wasn't about the competition anymore. It was about identity, about whether the part of her that loved words, it felt alive when she spoke with feeling, was something she needed to hide to succeed, about whether excellence required shrinking. At school, the isolation grew. Friends she used to laugh with now teased her lightly about trying to sound important. Teachers praised her written work, but corrected her delivery. One counselor suggested she polish her style if she wanted to go far, carefully avoiding the word loud while circling around it again and again. Every message landed the same way. Be impressive, but not intimidating. Be confident, but not bold. Be heard, but not felt. Amara started questioning herself in ways she never had before. She wondered if passion was a flaw, if leadership only worked when it came in a certain voice, from a certain kind of person. She wondered if winning meant leaving parts of herself behind. The loneliest part was that no one called it racism, that made it harder to name, harder to fight, harder to explain without sounding dramatic. So she carried it alone, adjusting piece by piece, telling herself she was just growing, just learning, just maturing. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't growing into something new. She was being pressed into something smaller. And the silence, she was learning to perform the calm. Careful, acceptable silence was starting to feel louder than any speech she'd ever given. Still, she hadn't quit. Even in isolation, something in her refused to let go completely. She kept practicing late at night, kept writing drafts that made her heart race, kept imagining what it would feel like to stand on that stage and speak without apology. Doubt was heavy, but it wasn't winning. Yet, the spark came from an unexpected place. It wasn't a big speech or a dramatic moment. It was a pause, one that refused to pass unnoticed. During an after-school workshop meant to prepare students for the upcoming speech competition, Amara sat quietly near the back of the room. She had chosen that seat on purpose. Less attention, less expectation. The instructor asked for volunteers to present short practice pieces, and hands shot up across the room. Amara's didn't move, not because she didn't want to speak, because she didn't trust how her voice would be received anymore. As one student finished, the room filled with polite applause. The instructor nodded, offered feedback, then glanced around again. This time, her eyes landed on Amara. She didn't call her out. She didn't push. She waited. The pause stretched just long enough to feel intentional, long enough for Amara to feel seen without being forced. Something about that restraint loosened the knot in her chest. Slowly, she raised her hand. When she stood, the room shifted. Some students leaned forward, curious. Others exchanged looks, already bracing for the energy they had learned to label as too much. Amara felt it all, but she didn't let it stop her. She began speaking, carefully at first, choosing a piece she knew well. Her voice filled the room. Not loud, not quiet. A live dot, she spoke with rhythm, with emotion, with the same presence that had once made her fall in love with public speaking. For a moment, the noise in her head faded. She wasn't performing for approval. She was communicating, reaching, owning space. When she finished, the room was silent. Then the instructor smiled, not politely, not cautiously, proudly. She didn't start with critique. She didn't suggest edits or tone adjustments. She talked about clarity, about conviction, about how some voices carried truth more powerfully when they weren't restrained. She said Amara's delivery made people listen not because it demanded attention, but because it earned it. That validation landed deep. After the workshop, another student approached Amara, not to tease, not to warn, but to say her speech gave them chills, that they wished they could speak with that kind of confidence. That hearing her made them feel brave. Those words mattered more than applause ever could. Later that week, Amara's English teacher pulled her aside. She spoke honestly, not about fitting in, but about standing out with purpose. She acknowledged that the world often misunderstood passionate black girls, mistaking strength for disruption. And she made something clear. You don't need to become quieter to be taken seriously, she said. You need to become undeniable. That sentence stayed with Amara at home. She told her parents everything: the comments, the doubt, the fear of being labeled. They listened without interrupting, without rushing to fix it. When she finished, her mother reminded her of the family stories she'd grown up hearing, about ancestors whose voices had been called dangerous simply because they spoke truth, about how silence had never protected them, only clarity had. Amara felt something shift. The resistance wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was intentional. She stopped editing herself for comfort, stopped practicing speeches meant to sound acceptable. Instead, she returned to her original draft, the one that made her heart race, the one she'd been afraid to perform. She revised it not to soften it, but to sharpen it. The competition was approaching fast. Tension followed her now, but it felt different. Not like fear, like momentum. Something was building. And whether the room was ready or not, Amara was done shrinking. To fit it, the day of the competition arrived, with a weight Amara could feel. Before she even stepped onto the stage, the auditorium buzzed with nervous energy, students rehearsing quietly under their breath, judges arranging papers, teachers offering last-minute encouragement. The stage lights were bright, unforgiving. This wasn't a classroom anymore. This was the kind of space where voices were measured, ranked, remembered, or dismissed. Amara waited backstage, hands steady but heart loud. She listened as speaker after speaker performed, each one polished, controlled, careful. The audience responded politely, clapping at the right moments. Everything followed an expected rhythm. When her name was called, a subtle shift rippled through the room. Some people straightened in their seats. Others exchanged quick glances. A few looked curious. A few looked doubtful. Amara felt it, but she didn't carry it with her. She walked to the center of the stage and stood still. For a moment longer than necessary, to hesitate, to claim the space. Then she began. Her voice didn't rush. It didn't ask permission. It moved with purpose, rising and falling naturally, carrying the weight of lived experience and the clarity of preparation. She spoke about being labeled before being understood, about how passion was praised in some voices and punished in others, about how young black girls were taught early to edit themselves to fold their power smaller so it didn't make others uncomfortable. Room grew quiet, the polite, kind, the listening kind. Amara didn't perform anger. She didn't soften truth. She spoke with conviction rooted in dignity, weaving personal moments with larger realities. She named the cost of silence, not dramatically, but honestly. She spoke about reclaiming voice, not as rebellion, but as self-respect. Judges leaned forward. Teachers stopped taking notes. Students, who had once whispered about her, sat frozen, hearing a version of her they had never bothered to understand. This wasn't just a speech. It was a reframing. By the time she reached the end, Amara's voice was steady, but the room was not. The final words landed like a held breath released. She didn't wait for approval. She didn't smile nervously. She nodded once and stepped back. Silence followed, then applause, not scattered, not hesitant. Unavoidable. Some people clapped slowly at first, like they were processing something they hadn't expected to feel. Others stood. The energy in the room shifted completely. What had once been judgment transformed into recognition. Amara didn't look for anyone's reaction. She already knew. She had said what needed to be said fully, honestly, without shrinking. Whatever happened next, she had stood, and that was the moment everything changed. The results were announced later that afternoon, but by then, the outcome had already settled into the room. When Amara's name was called as the winner, the applause returned, this time without hesitation. It wasn't just recognition of her speech. It was acknowledgement of something larger that had shifted. Teachers exchanged looks that carried quiet reflection. Students who had once dismissed her voice now watched her with a different awareness. Not all respect. Amara walked to the stage again, shoulders relaxed, expression calm. She accepted the award without spectacle. No raised fists. No dramatic tears. Just presence. The kind that didn't need to prove anything anymore. In the days that followed, the change became clearer. At school, the whispers stopped. Not because people suddenly became perfect, but because they had been confronted with clarity they couldn't ignore. Teachers called on her without hesitation. Classmates listened when she spoke. Her confidence, once labeled as too much, was now treated as leadership. The adults noticed. The same administrators who had once suggested she tone it down now cited her speech in assemblies, praising authenticity and courage, not as a correction, but as an example. The system hadn't transformed overnight, but a crack had formed. And through that crack, something better began to grow. At home, the shift felt deepest. Amara's parents watched her move through the house lighter than before, no longer rehearsing herself smaller. She spoke freely, laughed loudly, took up space without apology. They didn't celebrate with speeches or photos. They celebrated with peace, the quiet kind that comes when you know your child has learned something powerful early, that her voice was never the problem. The community took notice as well. The speech circulated beyond the competition. Not viral, not sensational, just shared, quietly, purposefully. Other students reached out. Some thanked her for saying what they couldn't. Others said her words helped them recognize things they'd never questioned. Before, Amara listened. She didn't preach. She didn't position herself as a symbol. She remained herself, curious, driven, grounded. And that was the real victory, because dignity doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives when you no longer doubt your right to be heard. They had called the black girl too loud, but what they really meant was that her voice challenged their comfort. And when she refused to shrink, when she stood in her truth and spoke it clearly, she didn't just win a competition. She changed the rules of who gets to speak and who gets listened to.